to start this Gaslit Nation self-care Q&A with the wonderful Peter Kurth, the author of several books, including American Cassandra, the story of Dorothy Thompson, which has been optioned for a movie, which I was hired to write. So Peter and I have been brought together, hopefully through the hand of God, to make an extraordinary movie that Dorothy Thompson deserves.
That's right.
It's a labor of love. We both feel immense passion for this woman. We both want to bring her back in a big, meaningful way as a mentor for society today, because she's just extraordinary. Her moral courage, her moral ferocity, her moral clarity. It's everything we need now across the media, across academia, and the arts, and so on. And the life she lived was just adventurous and free-spirited and romantic and beautiful and brave. And we all need that in our own personal lives. Yeah. We all need a good shot of courage from Dorothy Thompson today.
Yes, we do.
And that's what she was like for her friends, for her circle of friends. She was just endlessly enthusiastic.
Yes, she was.
I want to share with you, Peter, that since we last spoke in our interview, I went to the Met Museum because they just finished an exhibit called Art for the Millions, Culture in the 1930s.
Oh.
And it was really interesting. And I've gone to quite a number of exhibits about the 1930s and all sorts of museums dedicated to Art Deco and so on, because I was doing all the research for my film, Mr. Jones. And so this exhibit was funny because right off the bat, it explains to you how FDR invested millions, a massive amount of taxpayer money into the arts.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Is part of the revival of the Great Depression. It made a huge, meaningful impact on people. It brought people out of poverty, especially artists, especially all sorts of designers. And what's really funny to see is how the product of that investment was a big resurgence of socialist art.
Yes, it was socialist realist art. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so one could clearly see how us in this modern age, we look back on FDR as this quaint Hallmark card with his cozy fireside chats.
Yeah, right.
And how he got us through this terrifying period. And we take for granted the real time flesh and blood, what that must have felt like. And it must have been absolutely terrifying to the moneyed class to see their taxpayer money pumped into these socialist art communities.
Oh, yes, he had betrayed the moneyed class. That was the moneyed class's point of view. He was a traitor.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what sticks out in this exhibit was the torches and pitchforks.
Oh, yes, that decade, the 30s. The U.S., of course, had the theme of isolationism running through it, but it couldn't stay completely separate from the culture of the time everywhere. And it was everywhere. It was in Western Europe, what we now think of as Western Europe. It was in what we used to think of as Eastern Europe as well. In Soviet Russia, of course, it was all laudatory of the state and the image of the state, what the state wanted. The same in Nazi Germany when they took power. We escaped that. So far, I think we may be in for it soon if the media doesn't stop pumping Trump up every time it can. We're going to have who knows what if that happens. But yes, the style was socialist realist, is what it's called, with, of course, any artist's magnifications upon that. It was a very fertile time for that.
They would show scenes of the crucifixion of children and women being crucified on the gears, the machinery of the factories of capitalism.
Yes. Oh, yes, absolutely. It was very, I mean, the left was truly left, and it was not silent in the 30s.
Yeah, I mean, it really just underlines how terrifying that must have been.
Yes, it was. It was a terrifying decade. It was in every way that you can imagine. I mean, the consequences of the First World War were developing without solution. They had not been addressed, really. They had not been resolved. There were ways in which they can't be. couldn't have been resolved because the loss of life was so staggering that there was no easy solution for that. There was for as they say, a whole generation of young men in Europe wiped out for no reason that anyone can possibly defend. That is as simple as that. It's the World War I is indefensible as far as I can tell. It was unresolved. The political, the upheaval, the complete substitution of ways of government, the new advances in technology, all these things that we hear about were very confusing to real people on the ground. And when the Depression hit, it was, however much the moneyed classes may have suffered and complained about socialism, it was much, much harder obviously, on the poor and the working classes than it was on the rich. And this was a voice that in the 30s, it wasn't stilled really until the war broke out. And the focus shifted to
external enemies versus the internal enemies of the class struggle. Because you had Hoovervilles, you had these camps and bread lines, food lines.
Yeah.
And you see a lot of that today with the migrant crisis in New York City, camps of people.
And what we're calling the homeless crisis, with or without migrants, it's indefensible. Again, how does a nation as wealthy as this not have some recourse for people in real need? I saw an encouraging statistic today about substance abuse, however, from that about 10% of the U.S. population identifies with substance abuse, has a substance abuse problem. But of all the surveys they do, about 70% report themselves to be in recovery or having recovered from it. So there are ways to address that as well. If there were a will for it, for substance abuse, for the homeless crisis, the migrant crisis, the border crisis, which is real to people, very real. There are ways to address these things if the will was there.
The real crisis is the wealth inequality crisis, which is driving this more than anything.
I would say that is actually what's really going on with everything right now. And everything else can be looked at in a certain light as a distraction from that.
Mm-hmm.
There are two economies, and there's a super economy created above us. This is all hand in hand with vague ideas about Armageddon and global catastrophe and climate change and all these things. And it's meant to be protective of the moneyed class. And it succeeds as that. I don't know what it would be worth if the whole rest of the world fell apart. I don't know what their money would be worth. But that's how they're thinking of it. Get as much for ourselves as we can. It's entirely lawful. The Citizens United was really the death knell of democracy in this country. If a corporation is a person like I am, what am I supposed to do about that? We're helpless with that going on. If that is the law, we're helpless. We're stripped of any kind of true voice in what's happening.
Yeah, it's really the Frankenstein monster that came out of the Powell memo of 1971. Powell being a rich white guy at the Chamber of Commerce who Nixon would then appoint to the Supreme Court. He wrote a call to arms for corporate America in 1971 because what happened in the post-war period with the baby boom, you had an egalitarian economy.
Mm-hmm.
You had a really strong and well-protected American middle class.
Right.
And the corporations were tired of accountability and regulations and consumer protections.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Powell memo galvanized corporate America to organize, to build political power, to move offices to Washington, D.C. and fight back. And they ushered in the big wave of deregulation and tax cuts for the wealthy, which was the Reagan Revolution, and then gave rise to the courts being captured by corporate interests and elite criminal impunity and Citizens United and so on. And Donald Trump was an obvious extension of that, of greed is good above all else.
But, you know, he, to the extent that he is supported as he is, he also has to be a front man for money. It's really, it wouldn't be happening if the money people weren't happy with it.
Mm-hmm. And that's the story of fascism.
There would be none of this. There would be no, these lunatics in Congress. I mean, we've always had lunatics in Congress. Congress is known for it, actually. But the prominence and the focus and the attention that is given to these outright loony people, including the current speaker, who really thinks you can go find where Noah's Ark landed. I don't know what you're supposed to do with this, right? Fine. But I mean, if that weren't satisfactory to the money forces, it wouldn't be there. We wouldn't be hearing about it. They don't ask me how to run the country.
But they should. I am here, and I will ask you your strategies for self-care, given what a prolific author you are and a professor. So I'm going to run down the classic list of questions from the Gaslit Nation self-care Q&A.
Okay.
Because the fight we're all in is a generational battle. We're here to do our part. You've contributed massively with your books and shedding light and bringing back these important voices to mentor us today. So I wanted to ask, what are some ways up in Vermont, wherever you go, what are some ways that you let loose and try to stay sane? And I'll just run through our questions here that I'll fire at you.
Okay.
What's a book you think everyone should read and why?
The Master and Margarita by Bulgakov, which you may know. Look at your face, you must know.
That's my answer to this question.
Is that right?
Yes.
Because it is mine. It's been mine since I was in college and first read it. It is a magic book, and it is true in every sense. Everything that it depicts is true. And it's got a completely Russian soul, which means that there's lunacy involved in tragedy, and there's love everywhere, and there's hope, whether it's shallow or brittle or not. There's effort on the people to cope. There's the idea of the devil coming to Stalin's Moscow is in itself just a genius thing. It is, I don't know how to describe it except it's rich in every way and beautiful in every way. And you will never find a truer or better depiction of the life of Jesus. I'll tell you that. That's how I feel. That's the book, hands down, for me, that I recommend people read.